Hello everybody, welcome back to Punk Ride. My name is Smee. Today we're going to take a look at science fiction and fantasy, the genre that is often mixed together, yet there are distinguishing factors that should separate science fiction from fantasy. Today we're going to explore those factors and also see what defines high and low in both of those. Stick around. Before we get into looking at the books today, I'm going to talk about one main overarching concept that's going to hold this video together. And the term is plausibility. Plausibility is something that in your world building must be the essential nail that holds everything together. If you lose a sense of plausibility, then you're going to lose your reader in terms of them believing the lie that you're telling. It's okay that you make things up. And I think that the extent of creation in science fiction and fantasy is one reason why those two are often melded together into a singular genre. But the reality is that the plausibility of a world building and the plausibility of the actual physics or the science within that world is what's going to distinguish those from each other. I have always had a deep interest in science. In fact, my undergraduate degree was in environmental science because the exploration of the natural world and how things work and how things functioned was always of fascination to me. And when I get into literature, when I read authors who were able to take an understanding of those laws of physics and then spread them thinner and advance them and create new technologies in a world that they've created, I was just enthralled. To be clear, when we're talking about high and low science fiction, what we're actually looking at is this arbitrary gradient in terms of the amount of science or the amount of technology needed to keep the world going within that story. If you look at a film like Blade Runner, everything in Blade Runner seems very plausible in terms of our scientific knowledge, even down to the lasers. We can build lasers. We just haven't made them into guns yet. But that doesn't matter because it follows the laws of physics. But the entire world depends on these technological advancements all the way down to the city building and to the vehicles they use to run around in the movie. This is not dissimilar. Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl, which won the Hugo Nebula Award. Fantastic achievement. I really enjoyed it. And it looks at genetic alterations and the mutations of genes to create new beings and new species and new technologies that govern this world. This is low sci-fi because it takes place at a time where it's a small contortion in our technological advancement, but the world is real and plausible. Other books like Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, which actually takes place sometimes on other planets, deals with space travel. We understand there is a plausible possibility of space travel, but we haven't done it yet. This world depends on that, which is why we consider it high sci-fi. But again, these concepts are often confused, and I think that even the publishing industry uses them kind of in vague ways that we have to question. Even an example like Dune, considered to be science fiction's supreme masterpiece. I think this pushes the limit of science fiction and fantasy because there are elements in here that go beyond our understanding of physics and of nature. The idea of telepathy, of understanding and reading the future, those are so fantastical that they go beyond science fiction. This one is right there in the middle. I would say it's cross-cutting those two genres and falls directly in the middle of sci-fi fantasy. And finally, on the other end of the spectrum, you have pure fantasy. Now, I'm usually not drawn to pure fantasy because sometimes I feel like the world building can be a little bit muddy because you're looking at so many different elements that you have to take care of that it becomes less believable in terms of the lie being told. Which is one of the reasons why I always go to Brandon Sanderson. I'm quite impressed at what he's done in terms of creating his own laws of physics and governing his world around those without wavering. That's a very, very difficult task. But nothing in this book is actually scientifically plausible. The world is created. It's a fantastical world, which is why we consider this to be high fantasy. Even genres like horror can be considered fantastical or fantasy. Horror has those supernatural elements that go beyond our understanding of physics. And even though you would never consider Stephen King a fantasy writer, I think you can look at some of his stories and say, oh yeah, that kind of falls on this side of the spectrum, or even a low fantasy type of genre. Of course, none of this really matters in the big scheme of things unless you're trying to write it. If you're a reader, you read what you want, you like what you want. If you're trying to write it, there are a couple things that you keep in mind. Number one is that if you're creating a science fiction novel, particularly a low sci-fi, get your laws correct. And if you're going to create laws in either of the borderline fantasy type novels, make sure that those laws are governing the world in its entirety. You cannot waver if you do those creations. Regardless of what you like to read, whether it's full sci-fi or full fantasy, it doesn't really matter. You do what you want. It's a free world. But understanding the differentiation between those two different types of genres will help you understand what the authors are trying to do with their story and maybe appreciate it a little bit more. Thanks for joining us today. Remember, if you like the video, feel free to put the like button or subscribe if you're not a subscriber. Until then, you just keep on writing, punk right.